live at 134 Sunrise Lane. Moved to the park 3 years ago. So I guess I'll start. I'm from the East Coast. I grew up, I was born in New Jersey.
The Jersey girl.
Many moons ago. And lived there. Went to school there, went to college there, and had my first job there. I stayed in New Jersey after school about 13 years, and then moved to the Big Apple, to Gotham, to New York City. And I had a couple of interesting jobs, but I finally found myself at the New York Times. And this was back in the late 1970s, so I was there in the 80s, really. And I was lucky enough to work there for 5 years. And I worked actually for the magazine, the Sunday magazine section, which back then, I don't know how many of you remember, but that was when newspapers were still big source of news, and the New York Times was kind of it. That was the paper of record, but I actually worked for the magazine section, the Sunday magazine, which was really nice because it was a weekly. You didn't have the pressure of the newsroom, the daily paper, and I was the editorial assistant to the executive editor of the magazine. And it was a really fascinating place to work. Not only just putting out the magazine, New York Times Magazine, and reading and helping to edit all of the writing that would come in from pretty much the creme de la creme of journalism at that time. And everybody wanted to get an article in the New York Times Magazine and land a cover, everything was great, but while I was there, I gravitated toward getting to know people who had the same interests that I did, which were food, wine, performing arts, sports. So one of the things I got to do is I went out on restaurant reviews with the restaurant critic of the New York Times, which then, that was it in New York. This guy, just like the theater critic, could close Broadway shows.
Was that Craig Claiborne?
Pardon me?
Was that Craig Claiborne?
No, this was much later. His name was Brian Miller, and young guy, and so we would go out on these reviews. He and his wife. I got to know his wife very well. She was French, and I was a Francophile, still am a Francophile. And so he would take either, it was he and his wife, they'd take 2 other people or 4 other people, so it'd be 4 or 6 people, and you would go to these restaurants. And one of the things is you had to like all different kinds of food. Like you couldn't go and say oh, I don't eat mushrooms, or I don't eat onions, or I don't eat, because you had to taste everything. And everyone would order a different entree and main course, and then you'd pass the plates. So you never got to eat a full dinner, but you got to eat all this fabulous food. And the thing that was nice is, I didn't have to then go home and write the review. I just commented, drank, you had this fabulous wines, and then, he'd be sitting there, very quietly, taking notes, because the deal is, people weren't supposed to know that he was there. And he would review each restaurant 3 times. He'd go for 3 different meals, either dinner or lunch, and it was just unbelievable. I just, as I said, got to go to restaurants in my wildest dreams I never would have gone to, because working for the New York Times was fun, but there's no money in journalism, or wasn't back then. Unless you're writing books, or unless you're a really well-known columnist. So But I also, at that time, which is no longer the case, I mean, you would call up a PR person, you could get tickets. You would call up, you'd say, hi, I'm with the New York Times, and I'd like to see Phantom of the Opera. And they'd say, oh, well, when do you want to go? Like October, the week of October 12th. Okay, 2 tickets at will call, and you would have the house seats. So this was opera, ballet, theater. I mean, I took full advantage of it, and as my mom, my beloved mother, used to say, she left no stone unturned. But I think part of it was because I knew I wouldn't always live there. It was very difficult living in New York at that time. There was a lot of crime. The city was filthy. This was right before good old Giuliani, who, when he was mayor, did a good job. I mean, he cleaned up New York City, before he got involved in other things. But I made some notes because my memory's what it used to be. But the other thing that I would do every once in a while, because our offices were on the 7th floor, and our offices were relatively posh compared to the newsroom. But I would go down to the newsroom on the 3rd floor every once in a while and just walk through the newsroom. And I did it time after time after time, and I would just walk through and I would just be like fascinated. And it was just all these desks, there weren't even cubicles, all these desks up against each other. And there wasn't even any division, like there was the culture desk, there was Metro, and then there was National, and there was Foreign Desk. And they weren't even separated, like you just kind of knew where one ended. And, desks like piled with papers and books, and it was just fascinating. One of the really fun times to be there was during election night, to be in the newsroom with election night when it was Reagan who was the president then, and it was just really exciting. I think the biggest thrill for me while I was at the New York Times, and I did bring a prop to show you, was I always loved opera. And one of the things was when, you would go to a concert. I loved, Luciano Pavarotti was just my favorite opera singer ever. To me, there will never be anyone like him or his equal. And one of the things, if you worked for the Times, you could get your name put on the list to go backstage. Not for operas, but when he gave concerts. So we go back one time for this concert, and this Italian photographer is taking photographs. And of course, Pavarotti loved women.
Of course.
And so this man took this photograph of, that's me. But I was a young thing, and he was snapping photographs. And so I went over to him and I said, oh my gosh, is there any way, I could get a copy of this photograph? And he said, yeah. And I, gave him my phone number, and I'll never forget, it was a couple of months later, it was on Christmas Eve, and he called me and he said, I have the photo for you. And he said, I can meet you at Rizzoli. I'm at Rizzoli bookstore. Can you get there? I said, yeah. And I went, and I expected like a little snapshot. He had this blown up, not framed, but blown up. And he said, it's for you, it's a Christmas present.
Oh, how sweet.
And so, you can only imagine. I just totally treasure this. And of course, I had a fox coat when I lived in New York, and I thought I was about the hottest
You were.
Me with the fox coat and cheek to cheek with Pavarotti. I mean, they don't even think about it. It's just like, come on. It's like, it was kind of downhill after that. No, not really. But I also, where are my notes now? Okay. So, lo and behold, I loved living in New York. I was young then. I always tell people that it's much easier to live in New York City if you're either very young or very wealthy. Because if you're young, everything's great, it's fun. And if you're wealthy, you can insulate yourself from a lot of what's tough in New York. You know, you don't have to take public transportation, you have your country house. So I loved about 9 of the 10 years, and then, my car was broken into. I kept a car in New Jersey, drove it into the city every once in a while. It was broken into. My apartment was burglarized, my wallet was stolen. And then finally I was held up at gunpoint.
Oh.
And so I was thinking, I think it's time now. I wanted a better quality of life. And the weather was starting to get to me, even though I'd lived on the East Coast all my life. And, but, where do I go? I was single, I, wanted to live at or near a big city. Where do I go? Boston, be just as cold. Washington, no good. I didn't know anyone here on the West Coast. So, lo and behold, one day, I also loved figure skating, and I had watched the Olympics in 1988, and it was the Battle of the Bryans, and this young fellow, Brian Boitano from San Francisco, had won, and I had followed his skating for a while, and I just thought, he was great. So one day I come into my office at the Times, and we always read the newspapers first thing every morning, and I see that he's in New York looking for, advertising options, so I thought it would be fun to write an article on him, because, backtrack a little bit. I had started doing some freelance writing, because when I was working at the magazine, I would see all these articles come in from these fantastic writers, and then, I would see and be part of the editing process before, it was published in the magazine. And these pieces were heavily edited, and I started thinking, maybe I could do this. I mean, not for the New York Times Magazine, but for some little publication. So I started doing some freelance writing. So I called Boitano's agent, and once again, the New York Times got me in. I said, I work at the New York Times. I'd like to do a piece on Brian, not for the New York Times. I mean, I had to be pretty clear about that. And so anyway, I got to write a piece on Brian. And we hit it off, and we became friends, which was really kind of strange. I mean, things like that. You don't usually become friends with somebody you write an article about. And so the article was published. I wound up writing it for, I don't know if the airlines still have these in-flight magazines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it was American Airlines had an in-flight magazine that was award-winning, and they loved it because he was only one of 2 Americans in that Winter Olympics in Calgary. There were only 2 gold medals won by the United States that year. It was Brian and, what was her name, Bonnie Blair. And so they said, yeah, we love it. So they flew me out here to interview him. So bottom line, he bought his first house in the marina, and he said, you have to come out and visit. So I came out. I had never been to the Bay Area, and I thought, this is where I belong. This is it, And I remember I came out in February, and it was green, things were still green as they are here. I left brown and gray and the East Coast, and there were flowers blooming, and I just couldn't believe it. And then of course we went to Napa and Sonoma, So it was with his help and because I had met him that I relocated to the Bay Area. I started looking for a job while I was in New York, and people would say, well, why don't you contact us once you've moved out here? So he said, this is stupid. He said, just come out, you can stay with me, which I did for a while. And then I was ready, I had gotten a job, I was ready to get my own apartment. He was gonna go out on one of these skating tours where they go for like months and months from all over the country. And he said, well, stay here and house sit. So I had the whole place to myself, which was really, really nice. So that's how I got out here, made the transition. And I had a couple of jobs here. I did work for the San Francisco newspaper agency for a while, but actually in outside sales. And then I really lucked out. I got a job at the San Francisco Opera, where I worked for the last 10 years of my career. And I was the assistant to the general director.
Wow.
And yeah, it was really something. It was just a wonderful job. It was very demanding. The man who I worked for was not easy, but people, you don't get to be the general director of a major opera company by being, a sweetheart, a nice guy, Mr. Nice Guy. But you know what? Part of it, because by that time I was experienced, okay? We're talking like 13 years ago, so I was experienced. And we understood each other. We respected each other. He had a great sense of humor. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. But as someone said, you never knew from one day to another, or even from 1 minute to another, which, his name was David Gockley, which David Gockley you would be dealing with. And the fellow, and he was new to the position. He had come from Houston Grand Opera, so he was brand new, and he was proving himself too. So we were in this together, and he had brought this young fellow with him who was his associate, director's associate, named Matthew Schobach, who is now the general director of San Francisco Opera. He took David's place when David retired 10 years ago, and that's when I had chose to retire. And Matthew's this lovely British fellow, and we actually had a code. I don't know if any of you ever saw the show Keeping Up Appearances. It's a British TV show. And the woman housekeeper named is Mrs. Beale, and her big thing whenever she comes on, in to see them, she's always announcing the weather over the channel. And she'll say, well, the weather over the channel today is, stormy, or it's such and such. So Matthew would come in and he'd say to me, what's the weather over the channel today? That was our code for what mood. And I would either say, well, it's cloudy. I said, or it would be like, oh my gosh, it's blustery, thunderstorms, or it's beautiful. It's mild, sunny, So that we had a lot of laughs over that. But my office was in the Opera House on the 4th floor, and it was just if you're facing, so if you're orchestra, it would be orchestra right, the stage. And on the 4th floor, if you walked out, you would be on the catwalk that would overlook the stage. So that came in real handy, when you wanted to go out and see, what was going on, or I'm a little ahead of myself now, but at the opera and shares the opera house with San Francisco Ballet. And so when the opera's not in season, the ballet is in season. And I also love ballet, so when they were in season, I would sneak down to see rehearsals, or if I wanted to see a performance, I'd walk out on the catwalk and I would watch the ballet performance from up above, which was really, it was just amazing. But one of the first, I started in August, and one of the first things was the opening night of the opera season is the Friday night after Labor Day. And that's when they have, the symphony does their opening also, and symphony does black tie, the opera does white tie. They encourage the men to wear tails, and not only tuxedos, but tails. And the women are all, you know, in all their finery. And there's actually a red carpet, and they walk in and they're all bejeweled. And I remember the first opera ball, you know, I was standing there talking to one of the colleagues, and I said, this is just like being at the Oscars, you know. And she looked at me and she said, yeah, except these people own their jewelry. Which is true, right? You know, at the Oscars, they're all borrowed from Harry Winston and all this one and that one. And it was just a kick, you know. And so that we would do, and it was a big deal about, you know, who was sitting next to whom. And that was where I got to meet and got to know our illustrious Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and her husband, because they are opera lovers, and she does not miss an opening night, no matter where she is. She comes back, you know, and of course they were always at the table of the show director, and she's just the loveliest person, in addition to being, I mean, you know,
Tough.
who she is,
Smart.
and just smart, and just so smart. But just, you know, getting to know her, and, you know, we would, you know, we'd just talk about clothes. I just think this is a really interesting tidbit. Her husband buys almost all of her clothes and jewelry. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, he has a really good taste. He knows what suits her. She doesn't have time, all that. I just thought that was a really cool thing. The other thing that I was in charge of, among other things, but the opening nights of like each opera during the season. And what that would involve is we'd have the opening, and then after the opening was a party for the cast. And so the cast parties were all held at Hay Street Grill, which is a nice restaurant in the vicinity of the opera. And I was in charge of, you know, setting those up. And we would have a full sit-down dinner, you know, have drinks before and all that. And I loved it because I got to choose the menus and the wines and all that. And then I would have to race over after the opera to get there, because then I would like greet the people as they came in, and then greet the artists, and I would jolly them up, as Matthew and I would say, you know, because people would come in, especially the artists from out of town, and they wouldn't know what to expect. And you know, you'd come in, and opera people are very outgoing and kind of flamboyant, and everything's hug, hug, kiss, kiss, you know, because they're mostly European, and you know. And you come and you just try to get people all up, and I say, oh, you know, so and so, bravo, kiss, kiss, you know. And then you would announce it, there's, oh, and I'd say, David, you know, Sophia's here, and then they go, oh. I mean, it was hysterical, but like they needed somebody to do it. You know, you had to kind of get the party going, you know, and of course, and I'm telling you all this because Peggy Hill, who most of you know, who is a major opera person, when I told Peggy this, she got such a kick out of it. One of the things was I would work all day that day, and I would work, our hours were 9 to 6. And then I would continue working, and then the operas, most of them started then at 8 o'clock. Now, most operas are at least 3 hours, 3.5. So I would continue working, then I'd change into something, more festive, and go down and watch the opera. And then afterwards, we'd go over to Hay Street Grill. Well, we had to wait for all the artists to come over to get out of their costumes, to change, and they'd all come all, glammed up and everything. And we'd have drinks, then we'd sit down and have this dinner.
Midnight.
So, yeah, it'd probably usually be about midnight. So I'd usually get home probably around about 1:30, going on 2 o'clock. And I remember the first opening night when my boss was there, and when we were going to leave, and I said, "So David, should we come in a little later tomorrow morning, And he looked at me and he said, "Well, if you need to do that, you can do that." He said, "But I'll be in at 9."
Oy.
So that was the end of that. So after getting home at this time, I had to be at my desk the next day at 9 o'clock. And this was, I was 70 when I was 60 when I started working there. And I remember I used to say to my assistant, like, "My God, Claire, if only I were 40 years younger." And she would say to me, "Linda, are you kidding me? I'd have trouble doing it, But he was a stickler, and then, as I would get older, I'd say, "Well, I'll take it as a day off. How about if I take it as a day off?" And he was like, "Well, I really need you to be here." And one time he said to me, "What if something happens?" And I said, "Oh, okay." And then he said to me, "Oh, you should feel flattered, you're that important." I said, "Yeah, right." Anyway, but we did that, and it was great fun. It was just the next day. I thought I was going to die. But, you get through it, and then until the next one. And most of them, unfortunately, were during the week. It wouldn't be too bad if it was on a Friday night or a Saturday night. The other person who was absolutely thrilling for me to meet during that time was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And she, as you may know, is a huge opera buff. She and Scalia used to go to the operas together. And she came for a world premiere. The man I worked for was very, very innovative, very big on world premieres, American premieres. And we did an opera of the Dolores Claiborne. Do you remember that movie with Kathy Bates? Yeah. And it was an opera. And she actually happened to know the composer. And she came for the opening of this Dolores Claiborne. And she stayed not only for the opera, she came in, we had a special lounge for donors, for intermission. She came, sat down, and she came to the party afterwards, had 2 glasses of champagne, hors d'oeuvres. She had 3 security people with her. But I just have to tell you how she was dressed. She had these black slacks and this gorgeous, cream color jacket with black trim. And then she had black fishnet gloves that she wore. And then over it, she had this long black velvet cape. And fabulous jewelry. I mean, she's really hot stuff. She is, and I was able to sit and chat with her, and that was really something because, she's RBG.
Yeah, she is.
Yeah, and what about she's beaten the cancer again? Did you hear that? I mean, my gosh, anyway. Yeah, thank God is right. Oh, brother. The other thing, and I do have a prop for this, a couple of people commented on
You're gorgeous.
what I'm wearing here, and the opera has a just fabulous costume shop. And the costumes that you'd see them, I mean, if you see them from the audience, they're fabulous, but when you see them up close, they're made incredibly, they're so beautiful. What they do about every 5 years, the costume shop has a sale. And they only do it that often because it just involves, it's so much work. But they hold it in this huge warehouse south of Market, about the size of a football field, okay? And it's on a weekend, Saturday and Sunday, and people come and line up like around the block, okay, to get, they only let a certain number of people in at a time. So I was fortunate enough to go. They have a preview on Friday night for donors, and I would go, and it was from, let's see, it was 6:30 to 9:30, and they would have wine and, you know, hors d'oeuvres and stuff. And so we went in, and I will never forget the first time I walked in. And just as far as you can see were rows and rows and rows of these costumes. And I started to hyperventilate. I really did. I just looked at it, I was like, okay, calm down, have a glass of wine. And it was the only time in my life I ever remembered foregoing the food, like hors d'oeuvres. I didn't have time because I was on a mission. And one of the things, they had big garbage bags, and that's where you put your stuff. You had to drag your garbage bag along. There was no place where you could put things aside or anything. So the first costume shop sale I went to, I didn't do it right. I got bogged down in one area. And what you really need to do, you've got to take a quick walk through the whole thing and scope it out, because you don't know what you're missing. And you know, 3 hours is nothing. I could have spent 3 days, and I wouldn't have been enough. And so, this is one of the things that I bought, and it's from the opera War and Peace in '91. I wasn't there then, but it's a partisan's costume. And this was just somebody like on the street. It was probably a chorus member or somebody. And one of the things I would have to say, both sales that I went to, I was really good because I only bought things that I thought I could wear. I remember like colleagues of mine and people buying like these robes and like gowns and caftans and like huge helmets. And I would be, you know, like the Brunhilde, remember the Brunhilde with the horns? And I would sit in front of her, what are you gonna do with that? And she said, I don't know, but I have to have it. You know, so I had this, the only thing I still have left, because as probably so many of us, I got rid of a lot of things when I moved here, and I brought this. Can I put this down?
Just put it on. Put it on your.
I'll put it on my thing here. I'll put it on my partisans. Let's see. But this would just give you an example. This is it's just a cape, okay? And this was, everything is labeled, and here's the label, San Francisco Opera, and has the show. This was from Ernani, the opera Ernani. The character is a courtier. The name, this was Mr. Meyer, and in 1984 it was Jim Meyer, he was the chorus member. But everything is made so beautifully. Wow. Everything is lined, and if you can see on here, it's got all this embroidery.
Throw it around your shoulder.
Yeah, oh, okay. But it's got all this embroidery around the collar, which I think is so interesting, because like you wouldn't see that from the stage.
Look at that.
But I mean, you know, why would they even bother to do this? But there's so much like detail.
Authenticity.
Yeah. And most of these costumes, like these jackets and coats that the men would wear, they weighed a ton. I mean, I don't know how they would sing. But I just brought this to kind of show. But that was another thing, that for me, it was really special to be able to do that, to go to the costume shop. What else? Oh, we almost out of time?
What?
Oh, are we? Okay. The only other thing is we had an opera of the novel The Bone Setter's Daughter by Amy Tan.
I saw that on TV.
Did you?
Yes, it was gorgeous.
And it was the girl, the woman who had the lead, became one of my best and dearest friends, and her name was Jane Chow. And we had some lovely years together, and I got to know Amy Tan through her. I got to know Frederica von Stade. But Jane, right after the opera closed, Jane was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and she passed away a few years after that. But she was my best friend, and it was just an incredible experience knowing her. And that's it. That's the story. Woo! It's kind of, compared to